And we are live. So, good evening, everyone. Kenneth Aguirre, Chair of the MVTC Legislative and Policy Committee. Welcome to our September 19th joint meeting with the MVTC WMATA Committee. And we are starting at 6:04. And our meeting is being streamed live as usual on our YouTube page. And staff has confirmed that we have quorum. We have two commissioners who have requested to participate electronically. Mr. DeFerranti, a member of the WMATA committee, is participating virtually from Arlington for a medical reason due to sickness. And Senator Eben, a member of the Legislative and Policy Committee, is participating virtually from Washington, D.C. No reason as he has a scheduling conflict. Can I have a motion to approve Mr. DeFerranti and Mr. Eben's request to participate remotely?
Second.
Motion by Ms. Garvey, second by Mr. Alcorn. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed or abstentions? Ayes have it. The motion passes. So we have several presentations and plenty of discussion ahead of us. So head and get started. We have one administrative item on our agenda, and that's the approval of the July 11th joint. Actually, need a motion on that, or is that just checking? Yeah, we're just checking comments, questions, concerns on meeting summary. Looks good. All righty.
If no changes, we accept them.
Accept them as is, and now I'd like to hand things over to my colleague and fellow chair of the WMATA committee, Mr. Alcorn.
Thank you, Kanick. So tonight, we're going to be addressing a standing agenda item for our joint committee meetings. We've been talking about it for a while, and we're looking for a long-term, sustainable, dedicated funding for public transit. So as we all know, there's several efforts underway related to this. There's DMV Move, SJ28, and Alan tonight is going to give an update on those. And then Adam is going to cover a peer transit funding summary and a refresher on staff's list of recommendations for the 2024 annual report on WMATA. And this is all going to feed into the legislative agenda shared here. So,
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Next slide, please. All right, this is going to look familiar, so I'll run through this really quickly. There's a lot of different moving parts. I know some folks, you've heard this a couple times. We're literally just about on the cusp of actually a lot of meetings starting to happen, as we'll have way more updates over the next couple. So just a reminder of that MVTC's right here of all the work we're doing. All this stuff is tying together. Our annual report we're going to talk about a little bit later. Our legislative agenda we're going to talk about a little bit later. It is all tying together. MVTC staff are very heavily engaged in all of these different groups, SJ28 as well as the DMV Moves effort. So next slide. So just a reminder, the DMV Moves, that's the really, really large scale visioning process that's happening right now. A lot of analysis looking at what do we want our greater DC region transit system to look like. There's a lot of conversations are happening. The task force is actually meeting next week on Monday, the 23rd, to have their next meeting to start talking through basically looking at what are some of the visions and goals, some high-level policy recommendations, some funding scenarios for analysis. So MVTC, as I said, we've been talking a lot about this. We've been behind the scenes providing a lot of context and information, feeding it into the DMV Moves efforts. So you're going to see those come up on Monday, like I said. A lot of opportunities for coordination, collaboration. I think where we're kind of starting out is what's that low-hanging fruit, things that we can do really quickly, things we can pull off, let's say, in the next year, 2 years, that really have a really big advantage and benefit for our transit system while we still continue to work on those really big, really expensive, really big, challenging things that we need to do for our transit system. So there's a couple of principles that have kind of floated to the top when it comes to Northern Virginia, Virginia's perspective on long-term sustainable funding. So I'll go through these really quickly. You're going to see these a lot whenever you hear NVTC speaking about kind of our position. This is stuff we've pulled in from conversations with all of you, with the commission, with the committees. So some of our principles are One size fits all doesn't work for the region's funding context. Adam's going to walk us through a little bit later about how different transit agencies are funded. We are one of the most complex. We have 2 states in the district and the federal government. That's part of our funding mix. A lot of different moving parts. So one size fits all approach doesn't really work for a region that's as complex governance wise and administratively wise as ours is. Something we've talked about also as well, similar to how we addressed capital dedicated funding back in 2018, the region came together, came up with a number. This is what we need to solve for. Figured out the allocation of that. And then Virginia, go figure out how you're going to pay yours. Maryland, figure out how you're going to pay yours. DC, figure out how you're going to pay yours. That's kind of thematically, because of our unique governance structure, the approach that we think makes the most sense. A big part of it, I'll come over to the Virginia side of things. All the work we're doing going forward is really making sure we maintain that key partnership with the state. Typically, if we kind of call it the 50-50% relationship, where the state's a very key funding partner for transit and the local governments here in Northern Virginia come up with the other 50%. It's a long-standing partnership, something we see is going forward. At the same time, as we talk about revenue down the road, maintaining what we already have, because what we already have is vital to keeping the service we have running today. So keeping that in place and then figuring out the delta, what we need on top of that to continue to grow our transit systems, to maintain our transit systems, to keep them safe and reliable, and to expand at the right time. The last one is a little bit of a nuanced one. Basically, if you remember, in the current Commonwealth budget, there's additional revenue that was provided for Metro in the 2-year budget in FY25, which we're now in FY26. Our legislative agenda we'll talk about later is protecting that investment, making sure it stays in there for next year. But also, because of how that money has gone into Metro's budget now, it's effectively, that's our new baseline. We've kind of reset the baseline. We asked for that last year in the General Assembly, resetting that baseline because we need to keep Metro whole. We need to keep it growing. We need to keep the ridership recovery that's happening. So that is effectively reset what that baseline is, making sure folks understand what that is. That plays very much into the long-term solves that we're going to talk about over the next 18 months to 2 years. Those numbers, how it fits into there. There's a lot of math we'll get into over the next couple of meetings and the next several months. But how does that all fit together with that new baseline? Make sure we maintain that commitment and the state maintains their commitment as well. So that's the big level picture. I think the DMV moves, like I said, meets on Monday. They're supposed to be putting out materials probably tomorrow, hopefully. So next time when we have the kit and we have the commission meeting in a couple weeks, so the first week in October, we'll have a little bit of opportunity of gone through that, report out on what happened at that meeting. I know several folks from MVTC will be there to make sure we kind of talk about the context and how it fits in that. Next slide. In parallel, SJ28, the subcommittee that Senator Evans sponsored and has stood up. We've already had once back in July, very introductory, getting folks introductory information of how transit works in Virginia and Northern Virginia. We're looking forward to next week, September 26th, will be the next subcommittee meeting. So this work is going in parallel with DMV Moves. Like I said, DMV Moves is focusing on that larger Maryland, DC, Virginia geography. The geography of this is Northern Virginia, NVTC, PRTC, VRE, everything within the Virginia side of things. So we have a couple of presentations that we're going to be going through with them. Again, a big part of it is educating the members of the subcommittee. Mr. Alcorn sits on the SJ28 subcommittee, as well as Kate Mattice. We're going to start the conversation about needs. What are the needs for our bus networks here in Northern Virginia? OmniRide's needs, VRE's needs. Metro is going to be there as well to talk about their long-term needs. We also talk about some really important things that we've heard a lot about, but it's another good opportunity for them to talk about the work they're doing when it comes to cost containment, when it comes to controlling cost growth. A lot of progress has been made. I've got requests from them to talk about the ridership recovery. Where does that stand? The fare gates and how that's really helped with fare evasion, knocking that down. So some really important things that are happening out there, another opportunity for Metro to really come and talk about that. At the last minute, actually, this got updated as of yesterday. Deputy Secretary Sargent's going to be there. Mr. Senator Eben accepted his request to present to the subcommittee as well, representing some comments that the administration would like to present. And also we're going to switch back over to a couple of other presentations from MVTC. One of them is talking about a 3% cap. We've talked about it a lot. When we get there next week, we're not going to go far down into the weeds about it. It's mainly a reminder that we asked for the 3% cap to be suspended for the next 2 years. Really important so we can readjust post-pandemic. That's still a challenge out there that we need to address. I think part of the work over the next year and a half of the subcommittee and the technical working group is what are cost containment options? The 3% cap is one tool. Are there other tools that still contain costs? So evaluating that, look at what the transit industry is doing right now. How are they controlling costs in other places? We've already started doing a little bit of research on that, but this is beginning that conversation about we can't forget about that. Otherwise, we're going to end up with a cap again in FY27, kind of get us back to setting us a little bit back in time to where we are with some of the challenges between Metro's formulas and subsidy. Last part will be actually the peer transit funding. So actually, you're going to get a preview of that in a couple minutes. I'll talk through that. Really, there's a lot to understand about how other transit systems fund their transit network, the sources of money, how the money flows, the governance structure, oversight, reporting, a lot of really good lessons learned. Again, even though we're the most complex with 2 states, DC and the federal government, there's still a lot for us to learn from experiences of some of our peers across the country. Just a reminder for this SJ28 subcommittee meeting, it's actually going to be in this room on next Thursday, up here from 1 to 5. It's going to be open to the public and also live streamed on MVTC's YouTube account. So a lot of really good information coming up, and we're looking forward to those discussions. Next slide. And this is my kind of catch-all, kind of a little bit illustrative. I'm not going to read all that. A lot of meetings coming up. A lot of meetings happening at the elected level, at the commission level, at the committee level, at the subcommittee level, and at the staff level to make sure everybody's in sync and where MVTC is able to provide really good, sound, technical information, support, and analysis to support all of this work. So stay tuned for a lot of different meetings, and I'm happy to take any questions before we jump over to peer transit funding.
Thank you, Alan, very much. I guess the one thing should know the answer to this, but I don't. In terms of the DNV moves discussion, particularly as it relates to capital funding, you talked about local and state. Is there any discussion about the feds?
Well, right now, the feds do contribute it used to be called PREA. That's still there. It's still in the process. I know it's a big political fight every year. I think that conversation is going to be a perennial conversation. I know reauthorization for transportation is, I think, in 2 years. So I'm sure that will be one of those perennial things that we make sure is part of our legislative agenda so we don't lose that really valuable money. And one thing down the road, too, is there an opportunity to index that to inflation and let it grow a little bit? Because it's kind of locked in at a solid number. And $300 million when you add together the federal and then the state matches, $300 million doesn't buy what it used to when I think this went into effect in 2008. So that's an inflationary side of things. You'll hear the inflationary discussion also when we talk about any new revenues on the state and local side as well. So that's an important thing, a lesson learned. Make sure we allow that money to grow.
I'm glad to hear that's there because obviously at the local and state level, we have done the adjustment after, our 3% cap, basically. It'd be nice if the feds could join us.
Senator Evan has his hand raised.
Oh, yeah. Senator Abbott, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Alan, I passed the original legislation in 2008 that allowed for the Virginia portion of the match to our $50 million a year, along with Maryland and DC's to provide the match for the federal $150 million a year. But when does the federal agreement run out for that $150 million a year?
I'm not sure off the top of my head, but we can find out. Maybe another year or two. 27. If it's in the current transportation bill, is 2 more years, but we'll double check and find out when that runs out.
Thank you. And also just to add, that today I spoke with Delegate Sickles, with some of the leaders on DMV moves from Maryland and DC, just to share with them what we're doing in Virginia, trying to keep the dialogue going and not duplicate things too much.
All right. Great. Thank you, Senator Evan. Any other questions, comments? Senator Snyder, or
Go ahead, you too.
Voted, Walter.
Do we know what timetable DMV moves is on? I've heard some thought that they might actually start talking about tax rates and alternatives, and that may get serious before the end of the year.
I think
So I'm just trying to figure out how, so that our deliberations move at a pace that's relevant to truly influencing the DMV moves process.
I think there's a nuanced answer to that. Some of it is we have to get through the next 2 years with our WMATA budget, which is the biggest one. Virginia is actually in a really good place. Like I talked about earlier, the money that's in the budget for 25 and 26. Maryland and DC do not have that 2-year commitment because they do an annual budget. So they will be having to deal with that. And they may have to pull the revenue levers on their side of things. Now, that being said, that's the short term. I think originally the idea with DMV moves was that it was going to be a little more aggressive and trying to come up with some revenue tools maybe for the next legislative session. But I think Virginia has kind of been loud and clear that we need a little bit more time to be deliberate to do the work we're doing right now throughout the remainder of this year and calendar 25. So we go in there with a very thoughtful and deliberative approach of how we want to solve the issues. Because the Virginia side, we're not just talking about Metro. We have to take care of VRE. We need to make sure PRTC OmniRide has sustainable funding and all of our local transit systems as well. So the solve that DMV moves is looking at is a little bit different than what we're trying to solve here in Virginia. So I think we're trying to communicate that. I know Senator Eben is well aware of that nuance, and other folks that are on DMV moves, and Chair DeFerranti. So I think any opportunity we have that we're going to continue to refrain, that refrain is like, we're going to be deliberate about it in Virginia. It is feeding into each other because there's a lot of information you're going to see come out of DMV moves. We're now actually using that data that they pulled together to do some of our work, to make sure we're all working from the same place. So there is a deliberate attempt to make sure they understand what our process is, and our timelines may be different, and that's okay.
I mean,
Okay,
All
thank
right.
thank you, Mr. Steiner. Any other comments, questions? Okay, then, Adam, I believe you are next.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. So tonight we'll have a survey of honest peers and how they use it. So as Alan said, there's a lot. I have an hour's worth of content that I'll try to keep down to maybe 10 or 12 minutes. So I will do my best. I think one of the first things to point out here in this next slide is that the 5 that we chose here, we picked in a deliberate way. So we kind of looked at 3 factors: age, governance, and size when you think about WMATA's peers. So BART and MARTA, just like WMATA got underway in the 70s. St. Louis Metro is a lot smaller than WMATA, but it operates within an interstate compact. And then CTA's operating budget is just below WMATA's, while MBTA's in Boston is just above. So that was sort of our thinking behind why these 5. Again, our approach here was to assess the basic structure, flow, the dollar amount, and then the percentage of total budget for these 5 peers. And what do we mean by dedicated? The short answer, and I'll come back to this at the end, is it's complicated and it works differently in different places. So we'll put a pin in that for just a second, but typically it's funding that's set aside in some way for use by a transportation state. So at the end, we'll talk about some findings to consider in thinking about potential dedicated revenues for WMATA. Next slide. Again, here we are talking about our FY25 operating budgets. In local funding, it's in dark green, fair and non-fair revenue in the lighter greens, and then federal and purple, which there's a lot less federal funding now than the last time we did a similar exercise back in 2022, where it was a lot of federal dollars in operating budget. So of course, we don't see that.
I interrupt real quick.
Yes, Ms. Gardner. Yes.
CTA is
Chicago.
All right, MARTA is
Atlanta.
Atlanta. I should know this. I know, but I don't. Okay, and then MB, that's Boston and St. Louis is St. Louis. I got that one.
That was straightforward. Sure.
Sorry.
Sesame Street episode. Sorry.
No, and then after some overview,
Yeah,
we'll actually
yeah.
dive into each of these agencies. So we'll talk about kind of where they are and how they work.
Oh, okay.
All right, sorry. to
Yeah,
derail us
okay.
A little bit.
Yeah, I joined in on that as well. Sorry. So Adam, please keep going.
Sure. So in each case here, so the dedicated revenues are generated at the state and local level. As far as percentage of total operating budget, CTA dedicated revenues are the lowest at 38%. St. Louis is the highest at 71%. And in terms of dollars, MBTA will see the most with about $1.5 billion in dedicated sales tax revenues in their FY20 budget. We do in the appendix to our materials have a slide where you can basically see the same chart, but see the dedicated funding as a percentage of the budget as opposed to dollar amount. So what are the dedicated revenue sources elsewhere? First, each of these agencies receive revenue from sales tax. The rates vary quite a bit. And moving down the table, and CTA, they're supported by a real estate transaction tax in the city of Chicago, where that rate is $1.50 per $500 of value. BART in San Francisco receives revenue from a 1% property tax in the 3 counties that make up the BART district. And then lastly, in Atlanta, a third of the revenues from a 7% title ad valorem tax supports MARTA. And that TAVT is a one-time tax that's paid when a vehicle is titled. So that's kind of the universe that we're looking at. Think about dedicated funding sources elsewhere. So we'll move to the next slide. The first agency profile here is St. Louis. So this is Metro Transit. They're the operator, they're the primary operator in the St. Louis region. Even though their operating budget is only about 15% of WMATA, and there's no heavy rail operation, it is important to consider for us because it does operate across state boundaries. So Metro Transit began in the late 40s and today is an enterprise by state development, which is a compact between Missouri and Illinois. 70% of Metro Transit's operating budget is comprised of dedicated sales tax revenues. In Missouri, these are collected locally and allocated to the state. In Illinois, the St. Clair County Transit District collects tax revenues and contracts with bi-state for service. So there's a different setup in the region as far as how they collect the revenue and get that revenue to Metro Transit. Importantly, I think one thing that we want to call out here is that sales tax rates differ. So St. Clair County has a 3/4 cent sales tax that they've had since the 90s, while the city and county of St. Louis have added incremental 1/4 cent sales taxes over time since the mid-90s. So there's been multiple measures that have passed and failed over time that sort of comprise what you see today here on the map.
Identification. Does this mean that the entire territory has the same sales tax rate but different shares, or they have different sales tax
They
rate?
have different sales tax rates to support transit. So that's a key point here with St. Louis and then a couple others as well. So that's a good question. Next slide. These are relatively high level, too far into the weeds with the mechanics, but do touch on some of those points that are important to call. So BART and San Francisco. So the counties of San Francisco, Contra Costa, and Alameda make up the BART district, and there is a uniform half-cent sales tax where 75% of receipts go to BART, while the remaining 25% is allocated by the Metropolitan Transportation Commission to local transit operators. So know that that's sort of a different setup than you see in St. Louis. It's different than you see elsewhere, but that's their sort of unique structure that they've set up as far as dealing with the receipts of those sales tax revenues. There's also a 1% property tax in the BART district that supports the agency. And between the sales tax and property tax receipts, BART will see just under $400 million in FY25. Counties outside the BART district have levied separate sales tax measures for one-off extensions of the system into the Silicon Valley. And again, here, I think the key points that we wanted to make with BART is that there are uniform rates in the district, but there's more than one operator supported by those revenues. There's also an intermediary organization that plays a role in allocating those revenues. So moving on to MARTA in Atlanta. The Atlanta region has here two different sales tax rates. So 1.5% in the city of Atlanta and 1% in the counties. Those revenues make up about 60% of the operating budget for the agency. Also, that tax that directly supports MARTA, where a third of revenues go to the agency, and it's a pretty small amount, only about $33 million in FY25. Interestingly, for MARTA, they have to meet their debt service obligations each year before they receive the dedicated revenues. So that's sort of one of the stipulations within their flow of funds and how they operate that's unique from the other peers here. And there is no state support for operations in Georgia. Well, at least for MARTA, I can't say elsewhere. For MARTA, there is no state support for operations. So moving next to MBTA in Boston, they're pretty straightforward relative to the rest of the bunch. They receive 1 cent on the statewide. Just under $1.5 billion and represent also the state last year's allocation. So that's basically a way to say, sales tax receipts go way up. It doesn't all necessarily go to BTA that following year. They are facing a pretty steep fiscal cliff. The latest that we've seen for FY26, according to materials they had out a couple months ago, is $700 million. So that's relatively close to a figure that we've seen here in our region in recent time. And then the last peer that we'll look at is CTA in Chicago. So like St. Louis and Atlanta, Chicago does have different sales tax rates in the region. There's a 1.25 cent in the city of Chicago and Cook County and a 0.5 cent in the Collier counties. And revenues make their way to the Regional Transportation Authority, or RTA. They provide oversight, accountability, finance type things for the agencies in the region. They allocate the revenues to CTA, commuter rail system, and the local bus operator based on where the taxes are collected. There's also a real estate transfer tax of $1.50 per $500 only in the city of Chicago that directly supports CTA. Of note here, there's also the state of Illinois. They transfer effectively a state match to regionally generated revenues. So interesting thing to point out about how they do that. Next slide, just a kind of quick table here to look at sales tax rates that support transit in other regions and whether there's an organization involved with the funds. I won't cover this in detail, but again, these examples offer revenues can make their way to each agency. There are no cases in which they go directly to the transit agency.
Yes, Mr. Schmidt.
So they're all sales tax basically.
They all have sales tax. A few have additional.
But sales tax is the main.
Sales tax is the main thing. We went beyond these 5. You continue to see that elsewhere in other agencies.
All right.
And I've got a couple more slides here. So next we'll move on to findings. So first, as we know, WMATA operates in a 3-state compact. It's important to note that revenues, again, in 3 of the 5 regions here support more than one operator. The 5 peers have dedicated revenues that are generated at local, regional, and state levels, and again, comprise between 38 and 71% of their operating budgets. Dedicated, it's complicated. There's not a universal definition. We'll come back to that again in just a moment. Next steps. The most common revenue, of course, is a sales tax, but rates do vary in different jurisdictions that support each operator. It's also important to point out that larger agencies tend to have more than one source. So New York, which we didn't analyze this next, so outsized compared to the rest, they've got 8 or 9 different sources that are dedicated to the agency. And then lastly here, I think this is really important to point out, is dedicated funding is not a fix in itself for long-term sustainable transit funding. So each of these agencies are facing fiscal cliffs of their own, varying scales and timelines. So I've put some figures down here again, about $700 for MBTA, $730 for CTA, the next budget cycle, and then $300 for BART in FY27. You get a smaller budget.
And proportionately, those represent what? 5%, 20%?
We have the table earlier in the slides. I haven't done that math.
Okay.
It's a significant portion.
Okay. Thank you.
Real quick question. this kind of discussion,
It's happening like in Boston and Chicago when they put us on the list of having the same conversation.
Yeah, they're saying, look at that weird WMATA thing.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
It's a
Yeah.
good question and funny you ask. In doing the research, there are like MBTA, for example, where I sort of pulled their number from. They talk about how WMATA addressed sort of what we did in this past budget cycle, coming up with additional investment from the 3 jurisdictions. So they're looking at what this region's doing too. Not in a dedicated revenue sense, but from a how are they addressing the fiscal.
Yeah. Very interesting. All right.
And then I've got one more slide here with some next steps. Again, going back to that whole idea of what dedicated means. Short answer, it's complex, means different things in different places. So what we're kind of proposing to do here, staff via our transit funding working group, to develop several definitions that can work in Virginia context. Thinking about some of the considerations here. So namely, predictability, flow, segregation, responsibility, very important to rail operators in our region. And then again, how that can all fit within how other funding partners operate. So that's all for this presentation. Happy to take any questions.
Adam, thank you very much. Great presentation, excellent information, shows a lot of the variety out there across the country in different systems. If you go back to the Sesame Seed slides. Just very quickly, you know, all that green on the left, dark green with WMATA state and local funding. One of the things I would recommend, and I think this really underscores it for me, we all know that we need more funding for transit, but I think as we're thinking about that, it's also really important for us to think about, frankly, reforming the way that we fund transit. So we should be thinking about this as much as a reform as opposed to getting more money, particularly at the local level. Right, exactly, because certainly, and I'll just say for Fairfax County, mostly that's coming out of the real estate tax. And, you know, and if we find dedicated funding formula or dedicated funding that frankly can replace some of that. And again, understanding we still have additional transit needs. I think it's very important to think about this as much a reform as long.
And I think a lot of people are looking at it that way, Walter, which is good.
Yeah. And it's accurate because
Yeah.
I think
We
we
can. Well, New York, even though they have all these sources, if you saw the article,
Just to
115 billion just in state of good repair to maintain sort of what they got. So it doesn't fall apart.
wow,
They've got a lot that's really old.
I'll say some of it's over.
15 billion.
too late.
Like,
Yes, Ms. Garvey.
I should know. Is sales tax considered more progressive than real estate?
Can I address that?
Yes,
I just, so there's a, you know, there's.
I think it depends on the jurisdiction. It depends on, it's also, I think, a matter of weighting. WEIGHTING, because I think in places where real estate is very disproportionately supporting now, then it gets to a point where it is regressive because it's just overweight balance. As part of a diverse, revenues, maybe not. But I think it also depends on how you do the sales tax. Is it, you tax, growth? Some of the things we've done in Virginia, I think over the years have made the sales tax more progressive.
I think one of the things we've talked a lot about at the staff level and has come up a couple of times at the committee level in passing is as we move forward, our strategy, at least from looking at this from an academic point of view from staff, is like taking a vein from some of these larger providers where we have multiple sources going in. Because some of the that are out there are very, sales tax can be extremely cyclical. So can you ideally get to the point where you have multiple sources that are going in to smooth out the predictability, to make sure you can have potentially a rainy day fund to smooth things out, to make sure it's got predictability to get through those different waves. So that's one thing we've talked a lot about. I think you'll continue that going forward, but one size doesn't fit all. And sometimes just relying overly on one source can be, looks like it's going to fix everything, but it becomes a problem down the road when there's an economic downturn, because eventually that cycle will happen again.
I would say a lot of things with that big dog.
All right. I would also just note, in terms of for Commissioner Carantonis, in terms of real estate, is basically an asset tax. Sales tax is a consumption tax, neither of which take ability to pay into consideration, in terms of income.
Tax yachts.
So they both have, I would say they both have problems.
With the variability of a tax. In our region, probably not, but generally. Issues, what we see here is that there is a significant piece of the budget of these agencies that is still not covered by the funding, but it's a combination of two. And if we take the dark green and the blue, it's about 2/3. So that makes it very clear for me that they are built up on this financial. So the public that agreed to the dedicated funding source, which is here sales tax most of the times, and the commitment of the state and the local jurisdictions, these are bearable to be stable. So that's what I see here.
Mr. Smith.
Adam, is this these sales taxes? So it can fluctuate. You're right. It's not a constant. It doesn't slightly go up. Sort of like the gas tax. Gas taxes for us. It's not consistent. It's all over the place. Potentially, possibly. I guess the same thing is playing out here in these jurisdictions with the sales tax for the most part.
It can. I think one thing to point out, so one example is to kind of redid the way that they put together that sort of 1% of the 6.25% statewide sales tax. 2008, they had projections that have wildly underperformed. So the sales tax receipts that they were thinking that they would get, and again, they did this in 2008, not maybe the best time, but the receipts that they were expecting have been nowhere close. So they've had all kinds of one-off measures going back even to 2016 to address a shortfall based on what they thought they'd get from sales tax. So is there fluctuation? Sure, it kind of comes and goes with the economy. But again, I think to Alan's point, I think what we're looking at is something where it's not just putting all of your eggs in one basket.
Yeah. And what about rental cars? Airline tickets, things like that. Are they sectioned out, or are they included in that overall bucket? Or are they taken out?
Well, last year when we did our work last year, we started with 40 and whittled it down to 10 and did a deep dive on ones that would, I think one of our biggest criteria is the ease of administration, but then also which ones would actually generate enough money to really start to make a dent in the hole we're trying to fill. There are a lot of very small revenue sources that get a little bit here and there that honestly sometimes may not be worth the political capital to do because they're such a small move. It's not worth the effort politically when you're trying to do a really big solve. Now, that doesn't mean you can't pursue it, but then there are other industries that have different other types of fees. I know when we did the work last year, we talked to the airports authority and they're like, stay away from certain things. Like they fought hard to get their revenue streams. They're another really important mode. They're another part of the economy. Everybody has their little bit of, we fought for this. You get a little bit protective of it. So part of it is like choosing politically and thoughtfully which ones make sense, which ones you can tie to transportation. Some of them you do try to tie it to transportation when you can. Some of them, like sales tax, are just a little bit broader. It's part of the greater economy. The work METC has done about the value of transit to the economy lifts everybody up and benefits the state. So there's a lot of different factors that went into that. If there's other ones you specifically want us to look at, I think we can probably do a little bit of research on that.
And I'm thinking, tell us.
Are you also kind of hinting at the services component of sales tax? Because some services I think in the broader DC region, not all states have sales tax on
Right.
certain services. So there's kind of a service definition for us as well. Right.
Right. Okay, if there are no other questions,
Walter?
oh, there are a couple online. Okay, good. I'll just guess. Senator Evan.
Good try.
Oh, well.
Good try.
50-50.
Mr. Dufresne, go ahead.
Okay, two thoughts. First, multiple sources is pretty attractive to me. But I think that there's thinking about Fairfax and your points, Walter, Mr. Chair, it's property tax and sales tax. I would struggle to actually make a successful equity argument on sales tax versus property tax, but I also think we have to have a system that works. But I'm not trying to question. I just think maybe it'd be helpful for us to engage further on that, and I'm happy to try and find time with you and don't want to slow down the train. But the more important point is that, at least as I've been thinking of it, and I'd love folks' thoughts in the room, because Maryland puts their money together statewide, if we did a sales tax if we said we reached a sales tax that Montgomery and Prince George's County would participate in, that would be irrelevant. Like, we could get their number and then they could figure out how the hell they want to do it. But at least from my standpoint, if we say to the other two jurisdictions, we're all doing sales tax, it doesn't seem like it works all that well with Maryland because they do a statewide process. And I don't know if I'm thinking incorrectly there or if folks have thoughts. We could use a sales tax to get the number, but then Maryland would have to figure out how they want to do it themselves. And I don't know if that's a correct way of thinking or not. It's not an original idea. It's just one that I've been thinking about.
And there's one, Alan, you're probably going to say this. There's one other variable there, which is if we had the same rate across Virginia, Maryland, and DC, we generate a lot more revenue in Virginia just because we have more sales by dollar amount. So, and it's not proportionate to our transit usage.
That goes back to the kind of one of those principles we talked about a little bit earlier of figuring out what the number is and letting each individual Maryland, DC, and Virginia figure it out on their own, because you're right, doing it from a very state-centric point of view, they have different levers, different policy considerations they need to manage that aren't necessarily the same in Virginia. So by regionally coming up with that approach, it allows us maximum flexibility of what we're going to do and maximum political flexibility to solve the problem within each one of the jurisdictions.
Yeah, and I think that, Matt, if you can hear me,
Yep.
some of the areas around the Bay Area and other parts of the country, there's a sales tax, whatever goes to transit, when what's ever left over a certain percentage or a certain threshold, it goes to the locals. And they could use it for public safety or schools or whatever it is they want. It feeds back into the local jurisdictions.
It's super helpful. I imagine there's tons of folks in the room. And I want to listen to the weighting point that you made, Mr. Chair. I just, my impression of having grown up in Fairfax, the property taxes, the weight is big. So I think the detail that you just provided, Paul, and the points that you made, Walter, are places to work from, but it sort of accentuates the point that we need to try to be figuring out what amount of money in total we need to some extent in parallel with this, what we're using is to fund it. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Matt. Actually, Ms. Garvey and then Mr. Garrett.
I wanted to get back to what Mr. Smith, because it took me a while to consummate this WMATA. They do get
To tell us. I don't know if you want to expound on that. I mean, I hadn't thought about that, but I would think.
Well, no, there's
Metro
some
is
areas of the
really
country that
increasing
do
their-
have a tax on, airline tickets or like an entry fee to the airport type of thing. It's minimal, but it adds up when you have millions of people.
Yeah, I mean, I just think if you looked at what WMATA is supplying to the airports to make it better for people to travel and more likely increasing their market share, whatever you call it, it's probably pretty significant. Anyway, I hadn't thought about that, so bring it up, but it seems like something really to.
Same problem.
So-
I just said they're federal, so it's the same problem.
Oh, they're federal.
Yeah. The airports, they're owned by the federal government. They're operated
They're
by
operated.
Emirates, but they're owned by the federal government.
Yeah, right. Well, that's all right. Same principle, the principle still holds.
How about the federal government just give us more money?
Yeah, well,
What's that,
that's one of the principles.
Exactly.
What was that Saturday Night Live skit? Never mind. Mr. Carrington.
So I find the conversation here very, very important because we have heard in one of the first DMV moves. I don't remember if it was there, but for example, some of our DC colleagues were saying, no, we will, so I was telling them, a dedicated source means a dedicated source. So we have to define what funding we have. So WMATA will always have a budget. We'll have a compact that says, contributes how much, what part of this budget, and we will name the source where the money will come from. The source may have more money, but the money that we need will be drawn from there. We won't have to negotiate the source. We are going to negotiate the budget of the agency. But they had a different idea. They said, we have to take all the money from the source and put it in one fund, which of course creates enormous inequities in a very difficult situation to negotiate as, different uses, different benefits, larger regions, smaller regions, more transit intensive regions, less transit intensive regions, etc. To Mr. DeFerrari, also a note, sales tax funding is never very equitable. What we normally do is we compensate those who pay the most for that, which are sometimes those who need the transit the most, with a preferential cost system that they are not get the most benefit of the system. So we invest in these communities, we reduce their fares, etc., etc. We can look at the example of how it works when we want to do that. So that's how we do. So any discussion of identifying sales tax revenue as a dedicated part of a significant part of a dedicated source will have to be hand in hand with a commitment to how we compensate those who are paying more into the system, which are people like most of our constituents.
And we can provide them more transit services.
Yes, so they need to be, there needs to be a balance that makes up for the handicap they have, because they cannot escape, or the tax is not commensurate with their income.
Thank you. Any other questions online?
Didn't see any.
Okay, great. Okay, Adam.
Great, just a couple slides on our annual report on the performance and condition of WMATA. So next slide, Daniel. So this is just a quick refresher on the 10 recommendations that you saw at the last joint committee meeting in July. I won't cover these in detail, none are new, but we are continuing to advance these in our report. And as a reminder, our theme this year again is to essentially carry forward the recommendations from last year, update them where necessary, and given the current state of play with all of these topics. And on the next slide, I did want to highlight some updates on one of them. So number 9, labor cost escalation at Metro. I did want to highlight that WMATA and ATU Local 689 executed a new 4-year CBA in late August. That CBA stipulates a wage freeze in the first year, so that's FY25 this year. Years 2 and 3 provide a 3% increase, and year 4 a 3.5% increase. Years 2 through 4 will see a cost of living adjustment paid only if inflation exceeds the wage increase for that year, up to a maximum combined total of 5%. So I did want to highlight that there is a movement with that recommendation as it's written there. So as far as next steps, we'll have a full briefing for the report to the commission in November and come back for approval in December. The report is due to the General Assembly and Governor by December.
Thank you very much, Adam. And just very quickly on the new ATU agreement, that's a big step. And, you know, the freeze for a year is a really big deal. So I appreciate not just what Metro management, but also ATU for working with Metro on that. You know, it does, in some ways, it mirrors what I know many of our local government employees experienced during the pandemic in terms of wage freeze. I know it's also a sacrifice for a lot of folks. So I just want to say I appreciate that.
It's even after that first year. A lot of work.
So thank you. That was
Not a staff, the union. You know, there was a strategy.
So thank you, WMATA, for tackling that. That was a big deal. Any other questions? Oh, and actually, Mr. Snyder, and then Mr. DeFranco.
Thank you.
Just to make the point that these are really not two separate issues, and to the extent that we can legitimately maintain credibility that we're looking at costs and expenses on an ongoing basis, not just the year, say, that we go for some sort of a tax increase. We're going to need to be able to show over time that we have worked with Metro to control costs and to get as much efficiency as possible. So my point is these two issues are really quite closely linked.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. DeFranco.
Thank you. I guess these 10 items seem reasonable and important to me. I just hope that maybe Adam and Andrew and Kate can engage specifically on Secretary Miller's letter with respect to the reserves. So, you know, Matt, you probably have thought that through already. And our audience may be the legislature, but I just think we should be aware of the tectonics there, because it's one of the 10 points that you made. And I'm just finished rereading the letter, and I don't think we should not do it. And maybe I don't think we should mention it. I just think we want to be careful about how we do. Is that reasonable?
You want me to talk about the reserve now?
Yeah, maybe both pieces of that, the reserves and I don't know if you want to talk about the service.
We don't have to.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got.
Well, I think we were going to do a little update on that anyway. So I think there's a little bit of a misunderstanding about what Metro is doing, and we're looking forward to the opportunity to clarify that. That said, I think the reality is, because of concerns coming at the state level in both Maryland and Virginia, it's going to be difficult for us to execute it right now. On the fiscal reserve specifically, you know, the policy is a policy. There's two separate discussions. There's the money and what to do with it, and then there's whether you have a policy. And I mean, every transit agency has a reserve policy, except us pretty much. Every government does, most authorities do. So we're very much an outlier here. And the thought process was, you know, let's establish a policy that's the board's policy. A lot of people didn't realize, including maybe the secretary, that in 2020, WMATA passed a resolution that actually gave the general manager the ability to establish a reserve fund solely, with no guardrails and no indication of how it can be accessed and what the uses are and those kind of things. So the board policy that we put on the table was to actually give the board that authority in a more transparent way with guardrails on how that's accessed. Now, we could have a separate discussion about whether we need to take, it's 28 million, which is the surplus that we've worked very hard for this year to establish. We have a separate discussion about whether that money should then be applied in some way toward next year's subsidies because of shortfalls that governments are having. We could do that with or without the reserve policy, but the reserve policy is just a more transparent way to show that. I think it's being misunderstood and misinterpreted by some. The other thing that was on the table as a use of subsidy and also addressed in the secretary's letter was the extension of operating hours on the weekends. Based on customer feedback, we open late. We open much later than most other rail and transit systems do in the country. From a Virginia lens in particular, we have 2 airports here that we were just talking about. If you have a morning flight out of one of those 2 airports, it's difficult to use Metro to get there because we don't open early enough on the weekend. So we wanted to use $1.5 million of that to establish that extra service and then see how it went. And again, there's objections to adding any service, so to speak. I think there's kind of a larger principle here, which is all of us are in government. We want to kind of get out of the mentality that if you have money, you have to spend it all, and you want to create an incentive to save money. And so, from Metro's point of view, as an organization that's trying to self-govern, albeit with essentially other people's money, we're trying to establish a culture that yes, we're going to have a reserve, and we should have a reserve, but if we can still allocate a little bit to expand service or do something good. And it's essentially an incentive for Metro to try to save money. Otherwise, if you don't have that, then what's going to happen? You create the typical kind of government culture where you spend it or you lose it. So, unfortunately, it needs to be hard to move forward on those things right now because of this discussion. Particularly, the state of Maryland has a major funding shortfall in the future. I think they maybe were under the incorrect belief that they were going to get the money from the surplus, which is not how it works. The Metro board would have to specifically allocate money. And if we were to do something like that, as I mentioned, it would probably be in the form of a credit or some other way of addressing next year's subsidy. We don't just, flow it back. So we'll see where the conversation goes. Mr. Smedberg and I will have the opportunity soon to discuss this issue and others with the secretary and with the governor. And I think we're looking forward to having that conversation and trying to explain a little bit better and maybe correct some of the misconceptions that exist from him and also from the secretary in Maryland, who was very aggressive in his opposition to this concept, which was disappointing.
I was just going to mention at the end of the meeting, but Matt and I are meeting with the governor on Tuesday or Monday? Wednesday. Down in Richmond.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. I just hope that Matt and Paul will look at the final version of this report for the sentences on this, just to make sure that we're.
Yeah, I think it's appropriate for MBTC, obviously, to continue its advocacy here to help set the record straight about what the benefit is. Another benefit, if you start accumulating money that we essentially have anyway, but you show it as a fiscal reserve, you start to see improvement in your bond ratings and things like that. We're currently not getting any credit for any of that because we don't show it that way. But
by the way, that's real money too.
Absolutely. I mean, most of us here are fortunate to be AAA credit. Metro is not. Triple. Us too. Everybody. Hopefully, everybody at the table is. But Metro isn't, and there's a real difference there in what we can do. And we're using the dedicated funding and other money to fund these capital projects. And we're selling bonds to do it, but because we have a lower credit rating, obviously we're paying more interest and we're getting less. So we specifically, working with our financial advisors, are looking for ways to try to improve that. And this was one way that I had, especially as a priority this year as a finance chair, to try to get done.
And Matt and I were at those meetings in New York, and every single one of those rating agencies asked us about a reserve fund, why you don't have it. Secretary called me last week, talked to him for quite a while on the phone one evening. And that's one argument I made. I said, look, even if we had this, it's potentially, we get better rates. We could save millions or tens of millions of dollars on some of the scale of these projects. So that argument did resonate a bit, but as Matt said, I think we have some education to do. I think there might be some misunderstanding about what we're really trying to do.
And typically bond investors don't look at lines of credit the same way
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
A question for you
Guys, just if it came up at all out of curiosity, what is a
Well, there's no, I mean, the credit rating agencies? No, they don't, they haven't identified a minimum. I think our policy was 10%. If, which is similar to what other governments and agencies do. We wouldn't get there. It would take us quite a while to get there. So I don't want to, be deceptive and say I thought overnight our credit ratings would improve. It would take building that. Yeah, but 28 million or so would have been 25 or so would have been a down payment on that, and then we go from there. So,
And we also put guardrails around how and when money is put in, taken out, how it's used right now. There really aren't any.
One of the arguments is let's get everything solved and then we can worry about this.
Yeah.
But I think the problem with that is I really wanted it like built into the assumptions that people were making about what Metro needs in the future, and also that these are the type of issues that get left at the table when there's a big solve, so to speak. And I'm just concerned that we won't really ever get back to it.
It's going to get over.
So yeah.
So thank you all for having that meeting next week. And I hope that the language in there about cost neutral maybe is an opening to, have discussions about an overall understanding, about, what might be. So thank you for working that out. I think hopefully there can be common ground on that. Okay, so let's move on. I believe Sophie, you're next. We're going to hear from Sophie on regional fair policy and technology, which are being discussed both by DMV Moves and SJ28. And she's going to provide us with background and updates on the status of fair policy in the region and its role in connected transit customer experience. So take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Alcorn. Yeah, so I'm going to change things up a little bit from what we were talking about and talk about Northern Virginia's current fair policies and the fair tech and collections that support them. I'm going to talk about some case studies from around the country, and then we're just going to finish up with a little bit of a discussion of some of the opportunities for growth in our region. So on the next slide, please. We're just going to start off with the context of why we're talking about this today. So like Mr. Alcorn said, during both DMV Moves and SJ28 meetings, there has been discussion, or fair policy collection has been brought up because it's a core part of a seamless user experience that we're striving for in the region. So I'm presenting today to make sure that we're all on the same page about how fair policy works and how fares get collected, both the strengths and weaknesses that go along with that. So on the next slide, this is just a current look at the this region's transit fare policies. You may have seen this before, but just a few things to note on this. So each agency has reduced fare policies to some degree or another, be it for seniors, low-income groups, or people with disabilities. And of course, Q and Dash are both fare-free, funded through the DRPT TRIP grant. And finally, this graphic also highlights just the range in policies around the region. So you can see there's a mix of different subsidies for school-age children. That one's I think particularly notable in this graphic. But we're going to move on to the next slide, because another way to think about fare policy is through fare collection. So within Virginia, local bus and Metro bus fares are aligned for those who collect fares, of course. And Maryland, local buses, they all collect $1 fares, or charge $1 for fares. For Virginia, this means that when Metrobus increase their fares, ART and Fairfax raise their fares to stay in line with WMATA from $2 to $2.25. There are also free transfers between local buses and Metro buses. So there's a $2.25 transfer discount between the local bus and Metro Rail. There's also that discount between local bus and Metro Rail. But I'm going to talk about those transfer discounts a little bit more in the next few slides. But this graph at the bottom, I just want to quickly mention, shows ridership broken down by mode for the entire region. So that's the entire DMV region. So we have all of our agencies on this graph. The green you're seeing breaks down who collects fares. Blue shows who doesn't collect fares or plans to not collect fares in the case of Loudoun County. And so I just want to note on this that only 17% of local bus ridership was ridden for free. So even further, when you think about that like free ride as opposed to the entire, all the transit trips in the region or all the transit rides in the region, that's 2% of all ridership. And that's including all that local bus you see in the blue and then the little bit of blue for the streetcar as well. So moving on, like I said, I was gonna talk about a few different ways that transfers come into play. So we're gonna look at a sample trip for a trip from an Arlington restaurant to just some shopping in Georgetown. This may or may not be something I do. But in this case, we're gonna use Google Maps as a trip planner. And I just wanna side note this, that we can use Google Maps as a trip planner. You can use any of your other favorite third-party trip planning apps because they use a standard called GTFS. This is available for everyone, and it just allows all of that together. And it's publicly available. And DRPT for all the Virginia agencies requires that our agencies have GTFS regularly updated. Anyway, we can take the ART 45 and then transfer to the Metrobus 38B. And this is a great example of a bus-to-bus free transfer. And I just spoke about that a second ago. So when you get on the bus, you tap your smart trip card or your phone or whatever, and you pay to get on the ART 45. And then when you get to your stop to transfer to 38B, you tap again. But that free transfer means that your whole trip is going to be $2.25, which is the flat rate of a bus trip, instead of paying, double for that one singular trip. Ride with 2 trips. So I'm going to move on to a second example, which is slightly more complicated, which is just a bus to rail transfer. So imagine I'm having a nice meal at my favorite Greek restaurant. I have to get to the airport. So we're going to take the Fairfax Connector 401 to the Tysons Metro, and then I'm going to take the Metro to the airport. The entire fare for this trip, because of our bus transfer credit, is $6.75. So there is a $2.25 bus transfer credit that's applied, which basically cancels out the bus portion of our trip. So try to keep it simple. That's that. If you have questions, happy to talk more about it. The more you talk about it, the more confusing you can make it though. It's not that hard. Anyway, moving on to smart trips. So obviously on the next place, thank you. Obviously a huge part of this is smart trip. It's the core of our fare collection system. Every one of our bus systems that accepts fares in our region uses smart trip. Excuse me. When it was launched 25 years ago, it was the first smart card based system in the nation. And then there are 2 really important things that I think we should all remember about smart trip. The first of which is that it's a card based system, and the second of which is that it's a closed system. So a card based system means that all the information is held on the card itself. There's no account backing it up. That's why when you have your card and then you put it on your Apple Wallet, you no longer can tap with the card, it's on your Apple Wallet. And the second thing that I want to note is that closed system, which just means that the only way you can pay is with the smart trip card. You can't tap credit cards, you can't tap debit cards, something like that. And finally, just to note that coordination and payment for the smart trip system is managed through the Smart Trip Operating Funding Agreement, or the OFA. Metro hosts quarterly regional meetings. I just went to one this week that discussed smart trip with all the local agencies. We're all involved having this open discussion. So next, I'm going to just show you a nice little timeline about what's been going on with fare technology for the last 25 years. Yeah, since we started it all. So like I said, Smart Trip was cutting edge, and it was the first system in the US to have smart cards. And then our Northern Virginia local bus agencies joined Smart Trip between 2006 and 2008. And so for over 15 years, our agencies have been coordinating with Metro. Fare boxes, fare technologies, and transfers, all of this. I'm going to point out too that paper transfers were eliminated in 2009. So that means that riders who pay with cash at the fare box are not receiving a free transfer between buses because they don't have that paper transfer to show to the driver on the next part of their trip. So they're paying $2.25 for each trip. The other thing that I'll note, in 2018, NVTC conducted our regional fare collection strategic plan to determine what Northern Virginia could do to improve the customer and transit operator experience. And then at that same time, agencies are starting to test their own apps, and we begin to see fare collection practices kind of diverge. And then starting in 2020, you may remember WMATA started to make updates to its system with the Smart Trip mobile app and the wallet functions. This is when you're able to start tapping your phone or your watch instead of just the plastic card. So Smart Trip cards were added to the Apple Wallet in September of 2020 and the Android Wallet the next year, June 2021. So one more, or two or three more slides. That's good. Thank you, Daniel. So we kind of know this, but fare boxes are very expensive. That's one of the main issues with fare collection, especially for our smaller agencies. Also, given the complexity of our region, implementing new technology take a lot of time. This ends up meaning that some and sometimes a lot of our technology is used past its useful life. Our current system also makes it difficult to implement specialty passes or any kind of short-term products. So especially for our regional partners. So WMATA may be able to do it, but it's harder to spread around. So I have a wonderful example. So imagine Taylor Swift finally comes to the DC area. She wants to have this specialty Swiftie pass. She loves transit. That's actually really hard for us to do to implement beyond just having it in Metro. So if a Swiftie from Arlington wanted to take art, it might be a problem.
Andrew Swift.
I was hoping he would be. Anyway, so the last thing I'll say about some of our complexities is that fare capping is a feature that we don't currently have within our system, but as you'll see on the next slide, Daniel, please, something we'll talk about here. So I talked about a little bit of our issues, but I want to kind of move to some more positive notes and talk about what's going on in this sphere. All of the things that I'm about to talk to are currently available or currently exist in other systems in the region, or excuse me, in the nation. And we're discussing in our region. So the first of which would be real-time communications, which would allow funds to be available immediately on your card, as opposed to sometimes now there's a delay between loading up your card and being able to tap with those funds. I mentioned this as well. There's an account-based system right now, or we have a card-based system and account-based system would mean that the value, any value or pass is stored on an account on the back end instead of just on a card. So you could kind of have multiple cards, be able to tap with your phone one day and then maybe your watch the next. And that would all be coming from the same card. And then open payments, I alluded to it earlier, but that just allows you to tap your credit card or your debit card instead of that Smart Trip card. It's really great for tourists. I actually just did it last weekend in Boston. It was very easy, but that's something that we don't have currently available. And
we're trying to get that at Metro, though.
Yeah,
we're working on it.
Yes.
Yeah.
I heard about that in the Smart Trip meeting. So like I mentioned a minute ago, fare capping has been discussed. And it lets riders pay as they go, but then so they pay for an entire time period, and that time period is capped for a certain value. So that little graphic, I think, is kind of the best way to explain fare capping. That's an example from New York. I'm going to just finish up with two case studies very quickly. The first of which is Philly's SEPTA Key Advantage program. It's universal benefits program where employers provide this kind of all access monthly pass to their employees. SEPTA sells these passes at a discount, and because it's assumed not every employee is going to take transit, the cost is spread out across the organization, and therefore it's intended to be a revenue neutral program. This also has the benefit of encouraging more people to ride transit. And then the second case study on the next page is from LA. They provide low-income residents with a prepaid debit card. I think this is particularly cool that can be used for a range of mobility options. So that includes transit, but also rideshare, taxis, shared scooters or bikes, and even intercity bus or rail. That is also an option because they have that open payment. So that's just a debit card that LA gives their residents. And finally, I'm going to wrap it up quickly with just some opportunities for our region. The first of which, as I had kind of talked about earlier, aligning fare policies for low-income riders and children could help simplify the regional fare policies. You can think back to that fare policy graphic earlier with kind of all the different things going on. I will note, of course, there are two main challenges here about having aligning riding for children. So there are challenges with just administering those passes to school children across schools and school districts that can be really complicated, as well as just challenges with equitably allocating the costs across the region for that. So similar to aligning fare policies, there's also the opportunity to integrate more fully our local and regional transit providers into WMATA's fare structure and passes, like I talked about earlier with that pass. There's also space for an expansion of employer subsidies for transit that's going back to that SEPTA Key Advantage program. So that can either be through education and marketing of what we already have available, or even beginning new employer programs. And then as we saw in that timeline, there's also this opportunity to coalesce around one single central mobile app for ticketing and planning. And this is just another way to simplify and streamline our regional system, which is, I think, something that we're all hoping for. So that was a lot of information. I went through it really fast because it's late, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Appreciate that. I'm a huge fan of basically aligning all the different programs that we have on the back end, free and reduced meals for schools. Once you qualify for something, you should be boom. Yeah, it should all come together and, be more customer focused.
And I think blockchain is going to deliver in the future the ability for people to store that kind of information, that you can universally use it for many different kinds of things without having to fill out form after form after form after form on different systems. Wow. I think blockchain is going to bring us to that sooner rather than later.
Awesome. Okay, Ms. Garber.
Sophie, do we have any research showing the effect that so you get a pass for a month and it's a certain fixed rate, and so the more trips you take, the cheaper it is per trip? Do we have any about what it does to ridership and what it does to revenue? There must be some research because a lot of places do that.
There definitely is. I'm not familiar with anything off the top of my head, but
yeah,
I'm absolutely looking into.
Yeah, I mean, I'm assuming that would be something to look at. Just to see, and because that does get people on the transit, probably more. But then maybe you lose too much money. I don't know.
And Andrew has
Yeah,
a little bit of
I can
background.
give a
on
little
that.
context. I know pre-pandemic Metro was looking at it a lot, and some of the research they had showed that there was, I think, a net benefit to both ridership and revenue, relatively small, but still very helpful. I think post-pandemic, there's a lot of challenges because there's less commuting, like 5 or 4 days a week. And I don't think, I'm not sure if that paradigm still holds, but it's a good question to kind of keep asking.
Mr. Contreras.
So that was all fast and extremely interesting, every single piece of that. Question on the last one, coalesce around a single mobile app. So one thing I've noticed, successful big metropolitan transportation systems are usually having a very good app at the center. They maintain that, it's universal for them, it's tailored, etc. However, here, especially in the United States, we have a lot of competition for the trip planning part, etc., and huge players there, whether it is, Google Maps, which, look how it improved over the last 3 years in trip planning, etc. So how are we going to compete with them? They are not.
Or do we want to?
Yeah, or do we want to? I mean, is that the right strategy, or is it a strategy to create a module where everybody can actually, embed in the app and then say, okay, I want this pass to use this system. And I can get it through my Google Maps, or I get it through my Apple Maps, or move it, or transit, or so. I mean, I was in Cincinnati and I could buy the ticket through the transit app, and they had a module of their transportation agency that was basically an add-on to the transit.
I think you just mentioned 5 different vendors of Nick, to your point, you mentioned 5 different ones of how they're, I think that's what we're trying to figure out. Is the more centralized one the way to go where everybody feeds into one? Right now, Metro, they've got a way to pay and do a mobile ticketing app and trip planning, which is great if you're using the Metro system, but if you need to ride ART or Fairfax Sector, it's not integrated yet. So I think we're in that range of trying to figure out what's the best way forward because there are competing ways and are people, should we do that? I think that's a big policy discussion we have to have. A big part is that I think we'll see more of these types of conversations in DMV moves. That's a big part of it is the customer experience. How do you make it so easy? It's very, very intuitive. And you're right, multiple out there because people don't want to have 6 different apps on their phones to do something.
They have one.
That's cool. That's where we're trying to go.
Well, and the challenge that WMATA and other systems have is it's the software they currently have, the system. You know, the hardware is obviously expensive, but software restricts.
Legacy systems.
Yeah, Subcheck or whatever the company's are, really strict. So it makes it hard. We'd love to, when you go to New York, you can use your
That's what we
Amex
need.
or debit card,
That's
just
what we need.
you point your phone and
It's kind
boom.
of like
and-
it's just
I
like
mean,
the
soon,
like the
but
Easy Pass system.
it's
right?
not easy to do.
Easy Pass. So you go to San Francisco, you rent a car. How do you pay for the tolls? Well, read your license plate, you get a separate bill from Enterprise. You go to Oregon and you get a rental car and it reads your license plate. You don't have to worry about tolls or how you pay for them. You just get a separate bill. It's all bills. That's kind of system where, how do you get around in different places? They had figured out how to take hardware and how to take things like license plate readers and how to make this work. And so I know that we can do it. Like, I know that we can do it. We're just not there yet.
Well, I'm not wearing a license.
Yeah, I'm not gonna wear an ankle bracelet.
No, but what I'm saying with
That's another
but what
issue.
I'm saying with a universal app of some kind that you can use on any system. Doesn't matter if you're in Chicago or Boston or DC, and think about people who travel all the time and would use transit wherever they land. If you had something on your phone, you could use everywhere, like an Easy Pass, but the back end figures out who gets paid, right?
It's awesome. Yeah, that's a great goal. We should be shooting.
But one of the challenges, and I saw other systems implementing that, they use their connectivity, so they are embedded in Google Maps, etc. First of all, is the accuracy of telling you where, and then is the multimodal hopping. So you actually have, because the Google Maps is in densely used systems, is actually capable of saying what is the best way, not only in terms of speed, etc., but also comfort. How many people are on your bus, and when, is it better to get off here or get off later? So, and then they also connect with other transit options that are not going to be integrated in a public transportation system, like, for example, your Ubers and your Lyfts and your scooters and all this. I find this a very, a fascinating discussion, but I do think that, especially in this country here, we have really very, very strong competitors for the mapping part of this, and huge data sets that are constantly online. And so they know how people move over time.
Well, and just to finish on that point, which is there are policy decisions. I'm not sure how comfortable Metro or any of us would be to do what Google does, which is monetize that data. And and therefore they're incentivized, that's a huge. But perhaps this is actually a topic either this committee or another could come back to, because the discussion, I think, is very.
This is very helpful. This definitely falls into our transit technology program. There's lots to explore. There's a lot of low hanging fruit. There's a lot of big dollar and big picture stuff getting there, but I think we've got the right group together to have those conversations.
Great. Let's come back to this. Yeah.
Sue does a lot of traveling and tries out a lot of transit. That's what I've picked up.
All right. Thank you. Let's move on. We do have one more item, and I know we're running a little bit late, so thanks everybody for their patience. Kanik, I'm going to turn it back over to you for legislative agenda item.
Thank you, Mr. Alcorn. So now we're going to see a preview of NBTC's draft 2025 legislative agenda. There are several essential legislative priorities. We'll have 25, with a heavy focus on long-term funding for public transit. I'm going to turn it over to Daniel to cover the draft priorities and next steps.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I get it. So we've developed a draft of our 2025 state and federal legislative priorities and are seeking a review. Many of the priorities are the same as last year's, with modifications noted in red. So on the state side, we've modified the second priority to reflect the additional state aid for Metro and temporary suspension of the 3% cap contained in the 2-year state budget. We have also modified the third priority to reflect a more general approach to advocating for the preservation of state, regional, and local funding for transit and transportation. We've also kept our support for protecting existing NVTC programs and funding sources, as well as ongoing support for transforming rail in Virginia.
Can I ask a question on that?
Yeah.
You or Amy, Chair, sorry. Do you think we need that fourth one there?
Preserve existing, or?
Is that something that's come up recently again? Are we?
Never terrible to have it there. So the reason we do that too is that if you have a general point there, if something comes up in the General Assembly, you don't have to go back to the commission. You get permission to work on it. This is something that we can just jump right in. So that's why we kind of have those general things in case of any like crazy fast threat, we're there. So that's why we kind of like keep it on there just in case. That's
cool.
A little paranoid, keep it on.
Yeah. It's a good thing in that.
A question, does that include the commuter choice programs?
Yes.
Okay, I want to make sure they're preserved.
That is in there, correct.
So moving along, we also want to preserve transit's ability to compete within the Smart Scale program. We've also added in a proposed priority to support ongoing efforts to streamline VDOT's bus stop permitting process, and discussed by some of our local transit providers. And so
I know, yeah.
Add that with as part of their feedback.
That aligns too with the report from DRPT. So
yes, absolutely.
On the federal side, as Alan mentioned, we're a couple years away from reauthorization, so our priorities for now are proposed to remain largely the same, with continued emphasis on maximizing the region's access to federal funding, both formula and competitive for transit. You'll see the last bullet on this slide. We've added a priority referencing the need to address challenges in domestic bus manufacturing that was recently highlighted by an APTA task force. So we've heard from some of our local transit providers on the importance of working with our federal, state, and local partners to ensure a sustainable future for domestic bus manufacturing.
Yes.
It is Priya.
2027.
Oh, it's 7.
Again, I think it's 2027.
That'll be the next.
Okay.
I have a question. I'm remembering some years ago, we were on the state to do more funding. The state to Northern Virginia by taking our cut of what the state gave us to the localities, and that went to the state, and the state put it in and said that it was their money and they were giving it to us. And that's still in here. Didn't we used to keep kind of bringing that up, complaining about it a little bit? Do we sort of drop that?
Yeah, what's the status of the I-81 funding?
I didn't know exactly what to call it. I just remembered.
I think that's Michelle, which yeah. I think
It's our marble.
Where's the marble, Libby? 2 slides. I think that falls under our generic protect existing state, regional, local, instead of naming all the acronyms. Like the authority is absolutely covered under there because just such a thing when dedicated funding, money was moved around at, I would say, the general objection of Northern Virginia. Taking money from the authority to do things. So that is our thematic, preserving our funding, protecting the funding that's there, trying to.
For a long time. It's gone. So sort of besides preserving, we want it back. Yeah, right.
That's why that's in there. And I think the authority definitely falls under that of trying to restore that. We're getting back to where we were before things changed.
So that sounds great. I believe it's in there. I believe in there. I just was wondering if we want to like be a little more explicit so we remind people, because like everything's forgotten about that.
No, this is what we need.
I'm just-
We can
I'm just
play
saying,
with the language a little
It
bit on that.
really stuck in my craw back then, and it still does. Especially when they take credit, excuse me, I'm probably, especially when they, just say.
All right, can we do next steps?
Brief overview of timeline and next steps. This committee will be asked to review and endorse the priorities at the October meeting. We'll then go to the commission in November for their review, and then finally coming back to the commission in early December for adoption of the 2025 federal and state priorities. So with that, happy to take any questions.
Let's just say, let's just say DMD moves, there's some general recommendations that came out of it initially. I guess we have some flexibility maybe to include that in a proposal or package.
Okay. I think we can come up with some creative language to leave it broad enough that we are. Yeah, I think I guess my idea is.
I'd have to be in there, but it just, I don't, who knows what our SJ28 committee, where that will go, or if they'll put forward a formal package, but just an asterisk somewhere maybe.
Recommendations.
I think we can probably come up with some.
Yeah, I'm just, you never know where all this is
thematic.
going, and I just don't want us to.
Okay. Something that doesn't prohibit us from
Yes.
advocating or boxing us into a corner. So we can't, if there's low hanging fruit that makes sense for NVTC to be advocating for.
Like a little note on the bottom or something.
Again, so we've got a couple more shots at this. This is the first round, and we can keep playing with this next month when we meet. We'll have refined this. We'll play with it a little bit more. We'll bring it to the commission. Sorry, I'm stealing your slide.
No,
We're thinking to bring it back to the commission towards the end of the year, so we have lots more times we can keep finessing, especially as we see things coming out of both of those efforts. All right.
Any other questions? I think for the good of the order, I'm going to say no. Okay. The next joint WMATA Legend Policy Committee meeting is scheduled for October 17th at 5:30. So please get that on your calendars. Then we will adjourn. Thanks, everybody.